looking ahead to COP15, where do you think we are now, and what role does the TNFD play moving forward?
Thank you, Natalie. In terms of where are we, and basically our roadmap to COP15 Part 2, we are making progress. You may be aware, recently we had meetings in March in Geneva, which allowed parties to meet for the first time in person after 2 years because of the COVID situation. And we are able then for the first time to really exchange views and look at the draft Global Biodiversity Framework. So as the result, parties were able to make progress by ensuring that all suggested texts and their views were now on the table and reflected in the draft document, which will enable them now to further advance the negotiations on the Global Biodiversity Framework draft. And actually now the text has been owned by the parties and no longer by the two co-chairs who had been responsible for its development. The negotiated outcome text reflects the views of the delegates, initial compromises for all the 4 2050 goals, as well as the 2030 mission, plus the about 21 2030 targets. Finance and business related themes featured both where consensus had been achieved and where divisions still remain. In terms of the broad engagement, for instance, I was pleased to see wide understanding of the need to include the language at the global goal level, the highest order in the framework, calling for alignment of public and private financial flows with nature. This mirrors Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement to some degree. The launch of the TNFD beta framework during the Geneva meetings signaled again the support and encouragement from the market to the negotiators, building their confidence to the ambition. Negotiators took this to heart, as mentioned even in my introduction earlier on, that draft target 15 calls on businesses, including the financial sector, to disclose their impacts and dependencies and manage their related risk, which is quite significant in the framework. This will likely see TNFD framework being picked up into national legislation rather quickly and systematically. A further area or some agreement was on the language to repurpose and redirect $500 billion per year of harmful subsidies into biodiversity positive activities, an effort which will also be linked to TNFD. Yet, in terms of divisions, parties still remain far apart on the means of the implementation of the framework, especially when it comes to availability of finance or resources. Some parties propose new funding, such as a 1% levy on products using digital sequencing information, such as DNA, for instance, to be put into the new Global Biodiversity Fund. That is yet to be further discussed. So negotiations ahead. In June, negotiators will meet again in Nairobi. Hope the Nairobi meeting in June will help further narrow the remaining divergences further. And I feel confident that we will get a strong agreement for people and for nature by the time we meet or live in Kunming, China later this year at the CPD COP 15 Part 2. Thank you, Natalie.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elizabeth. And the same question to you, Lorna.
At COP26, we saw increased recognition of two important facts. First, that the climate and nature crisis are inextricably linked. Climate is nature and nature is climate. And secondly, that we have to invest in nature in order to address the climate crisis. We have also seen increased interest by investors in natural capital markets, especially carbon markets, but also a lack of clear opportunities to make that investment. COP15 needs to make work on biodiversity mainstream so that it is everybody's job to address their impact on the natural environment, just as it is for climate change, and take an approach that involves all levels of government and society. In Scotland, we aren't one of the state parties in Conference of the Parties, but that doesn't mean that we can't contribute. We have been leading a global consultation on biodiversity with other sub-national governments, cities and local authorities and so on, called the Edinburgh Process. Through this, we have developed a draft decision on sub-national governments that we want state parties to adopt at COP15. In order to help translate global and national strategies into real, tangible, local actions. The Scottish Government is also supportive of the TNFD, and we have just joined the forum as a member. We think that it is important because it will help large companies and financial institutions understand their nature-related risks and help capital move away from polluting industries into the natural capital economy, leading to the nature restoration that we so desperately need. In Scotland, we have our Taskforce for Green and Sustainable Financial Services. We are having discussions about testing the TNFD and how we develop the necessary skills and expertise in Scotland.
Fantastic, thank you, Lorna. So now back to you, Elizabeth, with a question. So we know that the degradation of nature and the loss of biodiversity will be felt worldwide. Is the Global South having a fair say in the TNFD and the protection of biodiversity more widely?
From the earliest discussions on the idea of forming TNFD, there has been a strong recognition that the balance of intact biodiversity is in fact located in the Global South. More so than with the climate, where 1 unit of the greenhouse gas emissions is equal everywhere. Biodiversity is more complex and strongly linked to the issues such as resource access, tenure, gender, and others that are particularly relevant for development. So we see also the growing recognition that Indigenous peoples and local communities are vital custodians of the world's landscape. At least 32% of the global land and associated inland waters is owned or governed by such stewardships, where 80% of biodiversity globally is managed by the local communities. So community-led conservation is found to contain higher species diversity than the state protected areas, even when the main purpose of tenure arrangement is not explicitly conservation-led. So we recognize not only the Global South in terms of the parties, but also the local actors within them are vital important in the protection, restoration of nature. In addition, we still need to get more and more financial institutions and corporate bodies in the South to fully engage with and participate in the TNFD development. What one might be able to see currently, I will say yes, there is a Global South voice, but still it's the global, I will say, global North entities, but with extension sub-branches in the South, and not necessarily Indigenous Global South. So this is indeed a major paradigm shift for the financial sector that we still have to grapple with, compared to the climate, which is more top-down than bottom-up issue, which the TNFD has taken. We are making further efforts to reflect the Global South voices in the TNFD, for example, by setting up a fund to enable emerging markets to participate in the TNFD pilot testing and refinement, which is going on currently. And more widely, the debates around financing nature need to emphasize that financial innovations in de-risking tools to get nature finance to where it is most needed. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for those insights. And then over to you, Lorna. So in addition to government action, what other key enablers are required to progress action on nature?
A key enabler, both here in Scotland and globally, is partnership working, which is why it is fantastic to be involved in this conversation today with you, Elizabeth. In Scotland, we are using the government's convening power to bring a wider partnership together across society, which is critical to be able to progress action on nature restoration and recovery. We're starting from a pretty good place with strong environmental NGOs, our national parks and large research base, and a Team Scotland approach across the public sector. We are now extending the public sector Team Scotland so that we can bring the financial sector in and create more solid opportunities for private investment. I'm really looking forward to COP15 to connect with colleagues and organizations around the world and to really strengthen and build partnerships for investment and expertise in nature restoration.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lorna. So I think that brings me to draw a close to the meeting. So I think just bring out some of the key topics around climate is nature and nature is climate. Community-led conservation is key, and the alignment of public and private sector flows of capital is essential to take action on nature biodiversity. So it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Elizabeth and Lorna for your contributions and great insights today. And thank you to those in the audience for joining. Have a good day.